Off. Okay, good. Hello and welcome to a debate show without an interesting name. This is our premiere episode, at least on the re-release here with Atheist Analysis. And joining us, we have Rachael Slick and Sean, aka Venom Fang X, and he's kind of just getting loaded up here. So we are here to talk about, I believe the topic is whether or not their beliefs have an objective basis. So we'll see how cool that is and how that goes. Sean, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. I don't know if my mic is working.
Your mic is working. Your video is not working.
All right, let me see if I can get my video working.
Okay, cool. While he's working on that, if you have any questions that you want me to deliver either of the speakers, you can either type them in the chat. If you go to atheistanalysis.com under current events, there's a chat which will allow you to. I'll be monitoring it the whole time. And if you're watching on another platform but would still like to ask questions, you can private message them to the page at facebook.com/uninterestingdebateshow, and I'll be monitoring that throughout the thing as well. So, yeah. Sean, your camera's working, so it looks like you're good to go. Do you want to kick us off with your position?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean, and I am a Bible-believing Christian. So I will be defending the position that Christianity is objectively true and satisfies the criteria for an objective-based truth system, as in the reality of Christianity is not subjectively based. I don't think it's time yet for my opening statement, so I think, Rachael, you probably want to introduce yourself as well.
Sure. I'm Rachael Slick, and I am non-religious, I'll put it that way. And I'm arguing for the position that Christianity is not an adequate explanation for any sort of objective reality, and I'm questioning the idea that an objective reality exists at all.
And I believe that goes
Okay, cool. Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted there for a second. Sean, do you want to go ahead and give your opening argument, and then we'll let Rachael do it, and then we can...
Yeah, sure. I prepared an opening statement. And I think the format of this discussion would be a 5-minute opening and then followed by an informal discussion. Is that still the case?
That is correct, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll begin my opening statements. All right, so the purpose of why I prepared an opening statement was just to make clear exactly what my position is, and I'm hoping to address or I'm hoping to have addressed some of my contentions. So I'll begin. I'd like to start by asking a question and making a statement. So what is man's relationship to truth? Do we determine what is true? Is truth objective? Or is truth dependent on us? Must man find the truth, or must truth find the man? In either case, it should be clear to all that truth and man are at odds. Man wants to find the truth, but finds himself separated from it. Man's noble pursuit of truth is just that, a pursuit. This should tell us a lot about our relationship to truth, that it is independent of us and therefore objective. You cannot chase yourself. When dealing with fundamental questions about existence and consciousness, nature, law, morality, and God, we need an objective source of information that is not dependent purely on human autonomy, human reasoning, or human resources. Given our limited 5 natural senses, which only give us information about the natural world, we should not be surprised or perplexed then that those who adopt a worldview that states only that which is perceivable to the human condition exists are the same people who conclude based on their observations that only the natural world exists. If we limit the scope of our investigation to only that which is immediately perceivable to the human condition by natural senses or tools, we ought not to be surprised that our conclusions about the world are strictly limited by the senses or tools themselves. So taking that worldview further, the natural worldview, and seeing its obvious implications, we ought not to be surprised then that metaphysical realities, namely God, would be altogether imperceptible and therefore unacceptable to a naturalistic worldview which presupposes the non-existence of metaphysical realities purely on the basis of them being metaphysical. This is a bias that is unjustifiable and is readily understood as being a presumption based on the adoption of an epistemology which rejects any and all sources of knowledge or information that does not come from autonomous human reasoning or human senses. So to reiterate my point, to the mind who seeks to understand the world through convenience, it should be blatantly obvious that the adoption of a naturalistic assumption and the rejection of all metaphysical claims based on that assumption is both unjustifiable and may in fact be demonstrably false, if indeed there is a source of information which does not come from natural human senses or reasoning. However, we cannot begin our quest for truth, that is real truth, until we are ready to throw away our biases and allow what is real to define itself, rather than attempting to understand reality through our biases, assumptions, philosophies, and autonomous human reasoning. So long as we commit ourselves to pure human autonomy, we reject any notion of truth that is not dependent on human discovery, which limits truth to being only what humans can themselves discover and perceive, rather than what is really real. While simple examples can be offered, such as the existence of imperceptible atoms or parts of the color spectrum only detectable by special instruments, we are confronted and surrounded by realities which only 100 years ago mankind would have been completely unaware of and would perhaps conclude in ignorance that such things did not exist. We must therefore allow for the possibility of the existence of things which we neither perceive or know, and that should fill us with wonder and hope. Without this openness to truth, truth becomes nothing but our subjective experience of truth, limited to our subjective abilities to reason and sense. Should humanity have a natural limitation, which we most certainly do, that limitation would become the bar against truth, and we could go no further. I refuse to settle for such a subjective approach to truth, as I know that my perception and my reasoning is not absolute, nor is my knowledge complete. The human condition is one of ignorance, and to quote a phrase, it is as if we see through a glass darkly. We do not see everything, we do not know everything, and therefore I cannot accept any worldview that depends entirely on autonomous human reasoning to define and discover absolute truth. So this leads me to my main contention. Absolute and objective truth, independent of human discovery and reasoning, must be our goal in the pursuit of truth. Any other pursuit is not the pursuit of truth, but the pursuit of ignorance. If we are to run after our own ideas, our own perceptions, our own philosophies, we are seeking rather to define reality ourselves in vain, rather than accept reality as it really is. Reality is not dependent on us. Rather, we are dependent on reality. Epistemology seeks to answer the question of whether or not we can know reality as it really is. And while it is obvious that no human mind can at any time perceive all of reality as it really is, we are uniquely capable from all other life forms on this celestial ball to mentally ascend to ideas and concepts that are not limited to our sphere of experience. This is our first hint that perhaps the human person is made in such a way as to touch that which is transcendent, to be aware of that which no other creature on this planet is aware. For we are aware of things no other creature is aware of, and we do think deeply on issues of transcendence. It is unfathomable to imagine a human being who does not at some point dwell on the implications and possibilities of things that I mentioned, such as consciousness, nature, law, morality, and God. However, and this is my main point, reasoning about our own experiences, entertaining notions based on our own ideas, and all introspection about our nature and the nature of the universe can never itself deliver us to absolute truth. We already know the human condition is one of ignorance, despite our vast abilities to reason and think. There are only two possibilities. Either absolute truth is objective and personal and can reveal itself to a human person, or absolute objective truth is impersonal and cannot and will not reveal itself to a human person. If one would posit that there is no objective or absolute truth, one would hardly expect to be engaged in a conversation about such things, since we would have no notions of them. And I think C.S. Lewis gave a quote, I'll quote it. If the whole universe had no meaning, we should never have found that it had no meaning, just as if there was no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we would never know that it was dark. Dark would have no meaning. And so, if we accept the idea that absolute and objective truth are impersonal forces or natural laws or energy, then the quest for truth is over. There is nothing worth knowing and no way to know it in any meaningful, lasting way. We are left to autonomous human reasoning. So long as human reasoning remains, soon to be vanquished by inevitable mortal death. Such a view limits our pursuit of truth again to subjective and autonomous human reasoning and leaves us without a reason to care about the pursuit of truth, since there is nothing lasting to gain by it. And then alternatively, this would be the Christian position, If truth is personal, that is, if there is a person or a being whose existence is itself ultimate truth upon which all lesser reality is contingent, then we find that all reality is designed and all lesser truths are made to point us to the knowing and personal relationship with that ultimate being who is truth itself, upon which all lesser truths depend. However, these lesser truths to which I refer, meaning the contingent everyday facts of our universe, cannot themselves fully disclose this ultimate reality. This ultimate reality can, however, use the contingent facts of our reality to reveal itself to our human understanding in such a way as to not fully be comprehended, but to be fully apprehended. By that I mean, the human person can enter into a meaningful relationship with ultimate reality, insofar as ultimate reality has designed such a relationship to be. The question is, how is man meant to relate to ultimate reality? This brings us back to our initial topic and makes an important point. Either man is meant to relate to ultimate truth, which would require ultimate truth to be objective and personal, or man is not meant to do anything. And there is no such truth or knowledge to relate to or know, thereby destroying any such notions of the nobility of the pursuit of knowledge and the need for our discussing this discussion this evening. And I think man instinctively knows that he has been called to know the truth. It is in our very design. Yet our design does not itself reveal the truth to us. We look at our present condition, and we are not immediately being presented with any great revelations of ultimate truth. So the present is not an accessible way to discover ultimate truth. The future is uncertain and unforeseeable, so the future will not be useful as it leaves us with pure speculation. The past, then, is the only place left to look. Has there been a place or a time or an event in the past when such a disclosure of ultimate truth was given to man, and how would we know? And so, the first question we ought to ask, has there ever been any such claims of disclosure? Has ultimate reality ever claimed to reveal itself? Has such a revelation been given to mankind? It is indisputable that there have been such claims. In the writings of the Holy Bible, we are confronted with the claim that a being, namely God, who is eternal, self-existing, and the creator of all contingent truths, both created and related to mankind in his Genesis, and then many times thereafter continuing in history to give additional revelation, ultimately culminating in the incarnation of God in a human being, namely the person of Jesus Christ. Typically, the reaction to this claim is the claim that others have made ultimate claims of revelation, typically in alternate religions. The response to such a claim is fairly simple. Only the Holy Bible has the marks of authorship that warrant acceptance as having its origin in ultimate reality by virtue of three major components. The first is a personal deity who can and has spoken, appeared, and has been and continues to be personal with mankind. The second is a progressive revelation that spans the majority of human history, beginning with the first man all the way to modernity. And three, a demonstration of divine attributes, such as perfect knowledge of the future and its disclosure in prophecy. So these 3 points show that are made to show that the Holy Bible satisfies a criteria whereby we can know ultimate reality that other religions do not, and therefore is the only revelation to be considered as authoritative or ultimate reality. If true, the Holy Bible is a source of objective truth which is not dependent on human reasoning or senses, as both its information and descriptions of ultimate reality are not solely dependent on human experience or senses, though a human agent was used to write them. Therefore, should the Holy Bible be an accurate description and revelation of ultimate reality, the rejection of this revelation is akin to the rejection of ultimate reality itself, and therefore the rejection of truth and the defeat of humanity's pursuit of it. And so, in conclusion, we ought then only reject the Bible at the great risk of rejecting the noble quest for objective and absolute truth, to be replaced with autonomous and subjective human reason and experience. If my contention is true, then the rejection of the Bible ought to leave one without any sense of objectivity or meaning, or a means of escaping subjective human experience in the pursuit of truth, and it is my full expectation that this will be demonstrated in tonight's discussion. Those are my opening statements.
Okay, cool. Holy smokes. Thank you very much, Sean.
My pleasure.
Rachel, do you have an opening statement that you would like to make as well?
I do. It is significantly shorter.
Sorry, I may have been over 5 minutes.
It's okay.
You were, but I was actually going to cut you off, but then you said in conclusion, so I was like, okay, cool. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so mine is significantly shorter, and I feel like a lot of what you said, Sean, I agree with, but I'm guessing we'll get to that. I do not claim to have a universal explanation that answers all questions. I know that Christianity proposes this, and it feels very satisfying to have an internal framework of the world that seems to provide an answer for every given question. I do not necessarily view a comprehensive universal framework to be superior by default to one that pursues truth. Simply because a worldview answers questions in an internally consistent manner does not mean that those answers are correct, only that they are internally consistent, whether validly or simply apparently. And likewise, simply because a worldview does not answer all questions, it does not follow that the questions that it answers are incorrect. That being said, my mind is open to being changed. It was changed through reason out of Christianity, and likewise it can be changed back. I value the form of argument over the content, and I try my best to maintain a low attachment of my identity to the beliefs that I possess. I know that Sean's stance is different from this. This is one of my first questions. If I understand correctly, you have stated that you are not open to having your mind changed on the matter. If this is true, and please correct me if I'm wrong, could you explain why this is the case? And my second point relates to the topic of objective truth. The Christian standpoint is that objective truth exists and that its foundation, creator, or nature, depending on how you define it, and please feel free to clarify those definitions, is God. Now, this is something we have to explore in a great deal more depth. When I was a Christian, there were some indications in physics and in my own personal intuition that nothing exists unless it is observed, and I took this as an implication that God was the ultimate observer, that he was the provider of a consistent reality. This meant that there was an objective truth, and that God was it. But I think that here the crux lies on our definitions of objective and subjective. I would define objective as well as according to, I think, dictionary.com, I got it from one of those sites, as being the object or perception of thought, belonging to the object of thought rather than to the thinking subject, as opposed to subjective, with a subjective definition being existing in the mind, belonging to the thinking subject rather than to the object of thought, as opposed to objective. So to an extent, operating under the Christian worldview, there is an objective truth as it exists in comparison to us. It exists if you believe God exists and that his view is what creates ours. But the definition of subjective is existing in the mind. And if all of existence exists in God's mind, if all of existence belongs to the thinking subject, as the Christian worldview typically states, then all of existence is ultimately subjective. This seems to imply that objective observance is, by definition, not transcendent. This also seems to imply that there cannot be any such thing as an objective observer. And that is all I have to say. Marks the closing of my opening statement, and I guess it's back to you.
That was significantly shorter than mine. Not a bad thing. Conciseness is to be commended. Does the moderator want to interject, or should we just...
No, man. Y'all go ahead. Y'all just do your thing. I'll interject if I have to.
Okay, sure. Okay, so one thing that stuck out, I was trying to take notes during your opening statements, just so I could, look at what you said and perhaps respond to it. You said one criticism you had of Christians is they're not open to having their mind changed.
Not necessarily in those words. I said that I believe that you had stated in the past that you're not prepared to have your mind changed. But I offered for you to correct me if I'm wrong.
I think it would be fair to say that I am 100% committed to my worldview, my faith, my God, and so to say that I am open to my faith being changed or my worldview being changed or me renouncing my God, no, I'm not. And so I can understand why some people would say that that's not a virtue. Because it seems closed-minded. I would say it's only virtuous if the God to which I have committed is, one, truthful. So if I have commit myself to the truth, then to not be open to anything else I would see as not a virtue that I myself possess, but rather a virtue that God himself possesses. And so the fact that he can draw from his creatures an absolute commitment, especially in issues of epistemology, shows that God is that which satisfies these amazingly large questions that we have about reality. And so my ultimate commitment to God does not really reflect so much on me as it should reflect on the ultimate nature of God himself, that he is the ultimate means of knowing truth. So for me to say that I'm not, or excuse me, for me to say that I'm open to rejecting him would be akin to me saying I'm open to rejecting truth itself, at least from my perspective.
I would argue that simply because the possibility of you being so sure could possibly indicate that that is evidence for an objective truth, but it does not necessarily indicate that. It does not follow logically. There are other options as well, such as, misguided certainty.
I would not say that my absolute commitment to God is evidence there are people who would say very much what I'm saying in respect to either other so-called deities or even perhaps atheism. Perhaps there are atheists out there who would say they're 100% committed to the non-existence of God and there is absolutely nothing that can change their mind, and I've encountered people like that. I mean, I've encountered many people who say that there's no way they would change their mind on that. So no, just because there's absolute commitment does not really mean anything. But you're asking me why would I be unwilling to not change my mind? And so I would argue, and this is not something that I think I could convince you of. I couldn't convince you that I don't want to use the word dedication because then it makes it more about me. I would say, from my perspective, in my worldview, God has revealed himself in such a way, and this is very much what the Bible teaches, that those to whom God has made himself known, to those whom God has drawn toward himself, he reveals himself in such a way that we actually enter into relationship with him, and that relationship is the basis of our certainty. So for someone on the outside who has no access at all to that reality, I can understand how that sounds very similar to any number of other claims to knowledge or certainty. I would only say the distinction is the reality of it would be different. There is no reality, so to speak, in regards to perhaps atheism. What is the experience of the non-existence of God, and can that be explained theologically? Can a person exist atheistically while God exists? And the answer, I think, is yes. Someone can be an atheist and God can still exist. And so I don't think atheism can generate the kind of certainty or even give an explanation as to why they are so certain, whereas I think a Christian, given if one grants that Christianity is true, at least for the sake of argument, there is certainly a basis for certainty in Christianity, and there is a means, a mechanism by which a Christian can be made certain.
I think I would agree with you on a great deal of those points. I agree that Christians experience a very powerful certainty, and I would possibly even say that atheists cannot have the same certainty that Christians have in their worldview. And I acknowledge that the personal experience that Christians have is immensely powerful and persuasive. But I do not think that the points you gave necessarily lead to any sort of absolute knowledge. For example, like brain in the vat theory. Like there's the potential, it might be 0.001, as you know, that we're just a brain in a vat and all of our experiences are being simulated by great dark overlords. And so to have absolute knowledge is to claim that I know for sure that that is not the case. What leads you to say that, for example, the brain in a vat theory is not a possibility within your worldview?
Sure, and that's where in my opening statements I said there are two views of truth. I was sort of reading a pre-made script, so I'll try to break it down without just having to read it again. There are two views. Truth is personal and can reveal itself in a personal way, or it can't, or it isn't. All right. So if you are a brain in a vat, if that was the case, and the Matrix or whatever, if that was the way reality was, you're right. We would be in the Matrix and we'd never be able to escape it, and that would just be the way it is. But that's not what not only not what I believe, that's not what I've encountered. As a Christian, I claim to have encountered absolute truth in the person of Jesus Christ, in the God of the Bible, who has penetrated through all that it is a thought experiment. The brain in the vat, the matrix, all that sort of stuff. I believe the God of the Bible provides the kind of revelation that would pierce through those kind of epistemological concerns and hypotheticals and reveals truth as it really is. And so I think man, if without a personal God, without a personal revelator who is itself absolute truth, and this is what I was arguing for, without that, there is no other means of escaping endless speculation and subjective views of truth. If you reject the notion of the God of the Bible, you are left in this endless confusion and endless amounts of thought experiments. You could say, what if there's a demonic deceiver? That's from Rene Descartes, or the Matrix, or the brain in the vat. I would ask you, now alternatively, how do you escape the brain in the vat? How do you escape these sort of hypothetical thought experiments?
I don't. I would say the only absolute knowledge I have is I think, therefore I am. That's the only thing I can know for sure, because it is not like a conclusion I come to. It is rather the nature of the coming to, if that makes sense. And I don't say, I would argue that the Christian God in itself cannot be objective.
Okay, go back to that, because you were saying that if everything in reality was subject to God's I think this is what you were saying. Everything in reality was subject to God's thought, therefore there is no objective reality.
Right. Well, I wanted to make sure that this is what you believed. I'm assuming that this ties into your worldview based on what you said and based on my understanding of Christian theology. What is your position on reality as compared to God's thoughts?
Now, would you include God in reality, or do you mean reality as that which God created?
Can you answer both?
Oh, so you're asking me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I want to know what your perspective is, so I can address that specifically.
Sure. I mentioned in my opening statements that I believe there are contingent truths which God created. So it is a contingent truth that the universe exists. So I believe God created the universe, and so the universe exists both independently of God and I guess in a sense subject to Him.
And so, do you believe that the existence of a universe is an objective truth?
I just said that the universe is subject to God in a sense, and that's why I think, like for example, miracles are possible. I do not believe the laws of the universe are absolute. And so,
do you believe anything is not subject to God?
No.
Okay. I'm going to read my thoughts again. Continue.
That's fine. But when we're talking subjectivity now, I think we may be using, I don't want to equivocate, I want to make sure we're using the words carefully. When we're talking objective or subjective truth, we're saying the truth value of certain claims or the reality of certain things. Are they, when we say are they objective, we simply mean is the truth value self-contained in that reality, or is it subjective, meaning essentially there is no actual reality to it, it's purely a mental event. People talk about there are many truths, and when people say things like that, what they mean is something that's true for me isn't necessarily true for you. I like vanilla ice cream, you like chocolate. That's subjective. So is that the sense? Go ahead.
In a sense, any sort of experience is a truth in the sense that it occurs as an experience. So in that sense, all truth is subjective because all things are experienced.
And in the same way, that also means all truth is objective, because though it is subjectively true that you like chocolate, hypothetically, that is objectively true that you're having that subjective experience of your favorite vanilla ice cream. So it's inescapable that reality is of necessity objective. There is no such thing as a reality which is itself subjective and has no objective reality to it.
The definition of subjective is existing in the mind, and can reality exist if not in the mind?
And that's interesting because I think of like the double split experiment or things that are being done now in quantum mechanics where they say the observer actually has an effect on reality, and that has tremendous implications. So is all of reality being watched? Well, that's the question that emerges from those kinds of experiments. If the observance of something is what actually brings it or allows it to exist, then all of reality must be being perceived in order for it to exist, if that is if all the premises follow. And so I don't know if I would argue that way. I don't know enough about quantum mechanics to say absolutely that something can only exist if it is observed by an observer. It would be interesting to discover that. It would be interesting to say that reality can only exist if there is an observer. That would certainly point to an omnipotent, omniscient being who is aware of everything. But I've never argued that way. Just because I'm not certain myself. I don't know if that's how it works.
Sean, I have a question from a viewer. Is it okay if I pitch that real fast, or would it interrupt y'all's thing?
Rachel, you okay with that?
Yeah, for now. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. The question is this. There was a philosopher called Camus who founded a philosophy called absurdism. It was based on the idea that the ability to know objective truth is itself absurd for a human mind. And Camus called theism philosophical suicide because he believed that choosing theism as a response to the absurd was basically throwing away the problem. I'm curious as to how you would respond to Camus's assessment.
I think Kierkegaard, the existentialist, I think he may have responded to absurdism, so I would probably want to recommend Kierkegaard. I'm just doing because I don't have all of this immediately in recollection, but I know Kierkegaard responded quite in depth to Camus, and so I would recommend to anyone who's interested to look up Kierkegaard's responses to absurdism. But from the top of my mind, all I would say is this. I don't think theism is an attempt to explain the absurd, and I don't think that theism was just invented to explain that which we don't understand, which seems to be, when it talks about the suicide of essentially mental pursuits, it's an atheistic assumption, presupposition really, that God is not true. If God is true, then theism, far from being suicide intellectually, is actually rather the fulfillment of intellectual pursuits. And so really, the whole idea of absurdism is dependent on atheism being true. So long as atheism is not true, then absurdism is not true either. And so I think the issue, the debate over absurdism will be settled ultimately on the existence of God. Does God exist or does he not exist? If he exists, absurdism is false. Sorry, Rachel. That doesn't really allow us to interact if we just take questions. Not that I'm.
No, it's okay.
My apologies. I just wanted to pitch that one. Continue.
Okay.
Because the problem is, I agree with you in the sense that internally things are self-contained. But I think it's very important to be able to switch mindsets to both sides, to be able to entertain the idea. Well, if God does not exist, then X, Y, Z.
I'm okay with that too. If you want to, for the pure. If you want to just follow arguments to see where they go, even hypotheticals, I think that's fine. But I can't entertain certain premises that I fundamentally reject in actuality. I'll do it hypothetically, but I won't do it actually.
I think a great deal of the problem with the debate between religion and non-religion in general is that you can make either worldview very internally consistent. I mean, even with a lot of the problems most people bring up, why is there evil in the world? Where Christianity has a very good response to that lies very much, that answers all the other questions. But so does atheism. Both sides have a very detailed and large internal framework to deal with the world. So it's very difficult to address one or the other with specific points. And so I think it really comes down to which one seems to operate in the world better, utilitarianism, in a sense.
You would have to argue why utilitarianism. It's practical, right? So it functions. Do we base our lives purely on what functions? You'd have to give an argument for that, and I think the charge against utilitarian philosophy is it's circular. It's practical, and practical is best because practical is best.
We have to define what functions mean. Functions in order for what goal?
You would have to justify my commitment to such goals. And honestly, we probably would agree that most of utilitarian goals are very similar to atheistic goals as well as Christian goals. We all seek similar ends. We all want to live in harmony. We all want to be able to eat and drink and be merry or whatever. So it's where the conflict, and when conflict between these worldviews occur on specific issues. So whether it be abortion or any moral issues are typically what come to mind. Some things may indeed be, at least in my position, would be antithetical to convenience or perhaps even practicality. It may even cause some people extreme discomfort. It has in many of my cases. Sometimes to do the right thing in my worldview means to be uncomfortable, or to put yourself in a position which is not necessarily the most practical.
I also remembered one other point that I was trying to go to before I hit the utilitarianism. I'm sorry if I'm jumping around a little bit. But one of the indicators of a validity of a worldview is the difficulty of connections inside to make them internally consistent. Because explanations can be stronger or weaker, but they can be still considered valid in an overall framework. And so I would think that in Christianity, the internal assumptions that you have to make to connect a framework are more multiple and more and weaker in general than those with the atheistic framework. There are fewer
questions. Could you give
questions.
a specific example?
For example, biblical inaccuracy. There are explanations for the vast majority of contradictions in the Bible, so contradictions, but it requires like a leap of judgment in order to patch the gap. And so I would say there are fewer instances where you have to make a leap of judgment and a patching of the gap in atheism than you do in Christianity.
Bible contradiction is a strange choice. I mean, I think I would have thought you would have chose something different. I say that only because in my readings of the Bible, I haven't really, not that I'm unfamiliar with reported or supposed Bible contradictions, I've just never found them difficult to reconcile, and I never would have thought of them as contradictions had it not been someone who didn't believe the Bible purposefully attempting to find contradictions to justify why they don't believe in it. And
contradictions may not have been the best example, but it does work for some perspectives.
What other examples could you think of?
For example, like the question of morality. Why is there evil in the world?
Mm-hmm.
I would agree that I know what your explanation is for that, but I would say that one has to be, and some people it is not adequate.
Okay, my response would be... Sorry, go ahead. I didn't want to interrupt you.
And there's a multitude of questions in Christianity that you have to answer to reconcile them together. And in atheism, there are more I don't knows. It's not point at you believe this about this fact and this about this fact. How do you make those two go together? There aren't those so much as there are why does this happen? Like an external event that is not a presented contradiction, but rather a lack of knowing. Does that make sense? I might be explaining it.
I'm trying to process it. I guess I'm just sort of stuck on, I don't know how a person can, you're talking about the problem of evil now. I don't know how a person can take the problem of evil and look at the Christian worldview and say that that it's more complex, or that it's impractical, if you want to be purely practical, or that it doesn't doesn't graft onto reality in a satisfactory way, when to presuppose the existence of evil, and I assume by evil you mean that which ought not to be, or that which is morally wrong, unless you have a different definition.
No, I was just saying that's an interesting topic to go into, like what is the nature of evil, but continue.
I would just say that in order to have a meaningful discussion of moral absolutes or morality at all, one needs to appeal to a system of morality which is, and this goes back to our initial topic, which is objective, not subjective. Because as soon as you invoke a subjective view of morality, morality ceases to be moral. It becomes amoral. It becomes everyone decides for themselves what is or is not morally acceptable, and so there is no standard. And so just because perhaps the Christian worldview takes more explanation, I don't think that necessarily makes it more complex. I think it just means it's the only system that actually justifies the terms or the language we're using when we describe it. You can't describe what is evil. You can't even say there is a problem of evil unless you first have a definition. of what evil is, and Christianity supplies that, whereas in perhaps another worldview, like atheism, everyone has a different definition. There is no absolute definition of evil. There is no absolute
Do you find there
moral...
to be a necessity of an absolute definition?
Say that again.
Do you find there to be a necessity of an absolute definition?
Well, if you're going to say there's a problem of evil, to even posit that as a problem without an absolute definition, it's like saying the problem of blank with a word that has no definition. Of course there has to be a definition.
I think you can have in absolute definitions.
I agree you can have absolute definitions. The question is...
not absolute definitions.
Oh, not. I guess we would disagree on that. I don't know how you could function without an absolute definition and posit the problem.
Well, it depends on how we define absolute. For a definition to work, you just need to have a shared definition between two people.
Okay, but when I assumed that when you said the problem of evil, you meant like the classical, unless you're positing a different one.
I'm referring to the problem of evil as in referring to Christianity, like why does evil exist and what is evil? I guess more the definition of evil.
Right, so again, we're discussing definitions, and I think if you have a worldview that does not allow for you to have an objective or absolute definition, sure, you can have a shared definition, but the question is shared between who? If it's shared between two people I've never heard about, and their definition of evil is something that is utterly foreign to me, I don't see how that's either relevant to our discussion or why I should take that seriously at all.
Okay, but we're talking about whether or not like absolute is true. I think you can have evil is a language, to say that, and to provide a definition is a language, which by nature is relative to the people speaking. So the idea of evil as an absolute presence, as something that has a presence apart from humanity, seems a little silly, because how do you have something evil that is not involved with an observer or a human?
I would agree with that, but I think that supports my position, which is that there is a definition of evil. Obviously, humans are involved in it because we are the perpetrators. But the problem of evil, I think someone who does not have a working definition of evil is the one with the problem, because how can one, and I think most people would agree there is evil, people experience it, if not daily, they certainly are acquainted with it by living in this world in which there are things that happen which most people would say are unjustifiable or wrong, are morally repugnant. And so evil is a thing. It is a reality which we experience and detest. And so which worldview, if we're talking in terms of practicality, which worldview allows us to have that reaction and justify it? Why do I have such a moral indignation against certain behaviors? And it's because there is such a thing as wrong. Right and wrong do exist.
Before we continue, would you like to now address the problem of evil as a discussion, or do we want to get back on track? Because I think I'm okay with talking about what the nature of evil is,
okay.
But I think that would lead into a discussion about morality. And so,
okay, but
do we want to have
let's
that?
again keep the scope of the conversation in perspective, specifically because you and I represent two, if not opposing worldviews, at least two different worldviews. And so, in respect to our own worldviews, you said that there is no such thing as an objective worldview.
Correct.
Right.
Objective reality, possibly. It depends on how we define our terms, but yes.
Okay, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, so if you feel you need to define terms, feel free to do so. Mm-hmm. So, in respect to morality, if you say there is no such thing as an objective worldview, and I don't want to misuse the language here, so please stop me if I'm wrong, it would follow that you don't have an objective view of morality.
Correct.
Okay, so something specific. I guess I'll let you pick. Pick an issue, whether it be a moral issue or not, but perhaps one that you think would give me a morally indignant reason to respond. What would be something that you would think that I would consider immoral?
Let's say arbitrary murder.
Arbitrary murder. Okay, so in your worldview, is arbitrary murder objectively wrong?
I don't believe in objective.
Right.
So no.
So no. Okay. So does that fit? This is, again, if you want to just take a practical approach to reality, does your worldview is your worldview then practical for us to adopt? If we cannot say that arbitrary murder is objectively wrong.
I would argue that it is, but my worldview encompasses a great deal more than simply morality. My worldview is practical in that it reduces or disencourages murder due to other reasons, not necessarily moral ones.
Okay, so what would those reasons perhaps be?
Well, we were discussing this earlier, the nature of consciousness, and I was arguing that we are all one in the sense that consciousness is unified. The universe experiencing itself, you know that.
I know that. And I don't. I'm not going to assume the audience does. So
right.
That's probably going to confuse some people.
And then there's also, which I consider a slightly weaker argument, but the evolutionary one. Like if we want to have a civilization that prospers, we have to operate on certain shared rules. That is a side effect, but I would say not necessarily the main argument. So we can come back to the consciousness experiencing itself aspect, if you're good with that.
I'm good with it. Our audience is not, if you want to take a minute to sort of describe what it is exactly you believe. I think to the surprise of some, you do not hold a worldview that most atheists would. Yours is slightly modified.
Right. If you'll notice, I'd never describe myself as atheist. I describe myself as non-religious. Right. So, sorry, prize guys, to the people who had me on this show. I believe that consciousness is the universe experiencing itself, and that we are all one person, just looking at each other from different directions. And I know that at one point you believe this as well, mainly because. Yes. And this is a little harder to put into words, so maybe feel free to help if you wish.
Yeah, sure. I could definitely articulate what it is you believe. I think in a private discussion with us, you agreed with my description of your worldview. So you believe that all consciousness is a singular consciousness experiencing itself subjectively from different lifetimes. So essentially, you and I are the same person in different lifetimes, just looking at each other from essentially different time.
And this does not imply reincarnation. I do not believe in reincarnation in that sense. It seems a little odd. But anyway...
It does help to get a mental image of it. You believe there is a single consciousness which is essentially being reincarnated in every person.
I dislike the use of that word.
I can understand why, because it has certain Eastern philosophical or religious connotations.
And I don't believe in like a past life. Well, all lives are past and all lives are future. It's not a time-based thing. It's not like, you go for one, then the other. It's all just the same. But this leads back to my view of morality. Murder wrong because I am the person being murdered, and why would I do that to myself?
Right. So
it's a very selfish view.
Right, and I guess the reason I chose, or we agreed on the topic of subjective versus objective worldviews, was I challenged you when I believed as you presently do. I came to that belief based on my own thinking, my own philosophy, my own autonomous reasoning, but I couldn't think of a single objective reason to believe it was true. I have
objective reason to believe what was true?
The worldview.
Wait, which worldview? Sorry.
Yours, the one you presently hold.
Okay. All right. Continue.
I think you came to that conclusion as I did, based on reasoning. You thought it through. You thought that it perhaps was a reflection of the way reality was. But if you attempted to justify to someone why it was true, if you attempted to convince them, I don't think there are objective facts that you could use to do so. And that's why I challenge.
I don't believe that objective facts exist. Like I said, every framework that people have, every worldview is a series of internally consistent beliefs that cannot be externally proven. You can't externally prove anything. And so I believe that my viewpoint is simply another one of those type of worldviews. Cannot be externally proven, but I believe it happens to be more internally consistent, more easily internally consistent than any other worldview, which is why I hold it.
Okay, but you said that you don't think, not only there's no such thing as objective truth, you said you don't think there is any way in which to prove It sounded like you were an advocate of hyper-skepticism, that there is no way to be either certain or anything, or to prove anything.
Well, as I said, the only thing you can really be certain of is I think, therefore I am.
But it sounds like
Beyond
you're making...
that, like...
Sorry.
I mean, beyond that, like, you can't really know for sure. Brain in a vat theory. Like, there's a 0.0001% that you are, like, a computer simulation or not real at all, and just, like, this observer being in a brain in a vat, essentially. Like,
Right,
we don't know for sure.
In my initial statements, I said if you reject the Christian worldview, or a worldview which has the presuppositions that I share, you're left not only with this endless speculation, you're left unable to make truth claims. And so I'm curious, Rachel, why would you commit yourself to one worldview as opposed to any other on the base, if you have nothing else other than I think, therefore I am? I think, therefore I am is not a good enough basis to begin to build the rest, to flesh out the rest of your worldview. So it sounds like you want to go beyond I think, therefore I am, and then establish some other beliefs.
I am making, obviously, assumptions about the world works and the way that humans work. I'm assuming that this that I see before me is real. I'm not claiming to know that, but I'm claiming to believe it based on evidence. And I believe, like I said, I believe in my current worldview because I believe it is more internally consistent than others. And I refer to internal consistency and not external consistency because I don't really think external consistency exists. If you find an external proof for something and then you move to that external set, then that external set itself cannot be proven unless you move to an external set. It's like very similar to Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which is a mathematical formula that proves that you cannot... Wait, actually I have it written down here.
Sure.
It does refer more specifically to very specific aspects of mathematics, so I don't want to imply that it means more than it does, but it's the concept that I'm presenting. If an axiomatic system can be proven to be consistent from within itself, then it is inconsistent. Therefore, to establish the consistency of system S, one needs to use some other system T, but a proof in T is not completely convincing unless T's consistency has already been established without using S. And this is the basis of it, but I extrapolate from this in that if you have a system that is proven, you require external systems to validate it. But there is no end to that. It's a consistent loop. So based on that, I'm saying you can never have a truly objective. You don't hit a point where you're like, okay, now we know it's true.
The loop you're talking about here, so I guess in a sense it's like an infinite regression. You're trying to find the beginning of something that regresses infinitely.
Correct.
The Christian worldview satisfies that because it terminates in the first cause, which has no cause itself. God being eternal. God satisfies the criteria that allow us to have a beginning of our not only our epistemology, but the beginning of reality itself.
Right, but this is not something I'm using to apply to the beginning of time, for example. This is something I'm using to refer to the framework of a viewpoint, which can include or disclude time or the dimensions beyond time. I don't really find the beginning of the universe to be a problem in this sort of thing. And I don't think it addresses it specifically. I can go over it again if you'd like.
No, I think that was fine. I guess the only point I wanted to make was you can't escape that sort of vicious circle or that infinite regression without the Christian worldview. Your worldview is stuck in that regression because you don't have other than I think, therefore I am, and even that, some people are, could come up with some problems with that too. You do not have, because you've rejected any views of objectivity and truth. There is essentially no foundation on which to build, and so you end up falling and regressing infinitely without ever coming to a platform on which to begin to build from.
Well, you've made a couple of statements about this. One is that the Christian God ends the regression, and two, that I'm stuck in regression, as though stuck in regression is somehow inadequate for an explanation of the way reality operates. And I would disagree with both of those. I don't think that any explanation for God is an end to that infinite regression. because the explanation itself falls within the set. The explanation is the T system that explains the S system.
So the T system. Sorry, then let me understand. Perhaps I'm not. So in my response, so God was the T and everything else would be the S.
Right.
And so the problem is that you need T to explain S,
Mm-hmm.
and then you need something else. So
To
what was?
explain T.
But no, you don't. That was my point. T is self-explanatory or self-existing by virtue of being eternal.
I believe that you're using the properties of time to explain how something can be self-existing and not in requirement of an external system. Is this correct?
In a respect, yes. I would just point out that infinite regressions, whether we're talking time or we're talking logic, infinite regressions in any form, there's a unified way in which reality works. So whether it be time, mathematics, anything, infinite regressions are impossible because I think the universe and reality are logically structured, and so we should find that consistency if reality is the way I'm telling you it is. And I think all of that points to God being self-existing, because infinite regressions in any sense are impossible.
Can you elaborate on why infinite regressions are impossible?
Certainly. An infinite regression is impossible because what you end up doing is essentially trying to make an infinite finite, which is a contradiction, and logical contradictions can't exist. And so the reason an infinite regression is impossible, Hilbert's Hotel is an interesting philosophical thought experiment that demonstrates it. I like to use my own version of it where I ask someone, if I was to give you a chocolate bar after an infinite amount of time, I use time as a way to demonstrate an infinite regression. If there was an infinite amount of time between two events, would you ever reach the end of time? No, you can't have an end of an infinite. That's a contradiction. And so anything that essentially tries to put a beginning or an end to an infinite is trying to put a finite into the infinite, and the infinite has nothing that is finite. And so that's why an infinite regression is impossible. It's the mixing of the finite with the infinite, which you cannot do.
From what I understand, I agree with you on that, but I don't necessarily see how that means that infinite regressions are impossible. You can have them in math, for example.
Well, mathematics deal with hypotheticals. We can always argue hypotheticals. Math can do the same. Math is a kind of logic where, like any kind of logic, you can argue hypotheticals, but most hypotheticals are not real. You can do things in mathematics that are not real. You can add an infinite to an infinite, but you can't do that in reality because there actually cannot be an addition. When you add something to an infinite, it ceases to be an infinite. So again, that would be a contradiction.
I would argue with the subject that we're discussing. We're not discussing space. How far can you travel for a beginning or an end. We're arguing the nature of worldview. I'm saying that you cannot, if you have a way that you view reality, and if you have this reality that incorporates God into it, that is a system of thought, and you can go beyond that. You cannot prove that internally. In order to prove it, in order to have absolute knowledge, as you claim to have, you have to move it external to that system to make sure that it is proven.
Unless God, as I mentioned in my opening statements, unless the T in the system, or the fundamental of the worldview is a personal being that can reveal himself. So you don't have to go outside the being. The being himself is the one who does the revealing. So it's not an external system. It is the system itself.
The being who's doing the revealing would be T, revealing it to the S, the internal system, which would be, I think, in your worldview, us. Correct?
I guess when you were explaining it, I wasn't sure that you were saying that we were part of the system. I thought we were sort of, because we were discussing worldviews, so I assumed that we were the people who sort of sat outside of S and T, who were using S to justify T or using T to justify S. I wasn't sure that you were saying that we were S ourselves.
You're breaking up slightly, but you might be correct. I might be confusing, at least in speech patterns and conceptually, our personal viewpoint of worldviews, and then the view of God being the T to the S.
All right, maybe
I apologize for that.
Is just is a confusing way to put it. Are you saying that that God, if God exists, cannot justify his own existence, but needs to appeal to something else?
Appeal indicates like a subjective action, but in a sense, yes.
And if he was to do that, would that be unjustifiable or wrong or not create certainty? I'm trying to understand what exactly is your complaint.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up. Could you try saying that again? I didn't hear you.
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure why we're breaking up. If we are again, I can try and reconnect. Essentially, I was asking you, so if God cannot self-justify himself, if he has to appeal to another set or another system, is that a problem? Is that something God is not allowed to do or cannot do, or would that not generate certainty?
I would say that it would counteract the Christian worldview that God is transcendent or absolute.
And why? Why would that be so?
Because the idea, as far as I understand it, of an absolute God is that there are no external systems. That God is the ultimate external system, or as you said, the end of the infinite regression.
Okay, so I guess I'm having difficulty understanding the argument. Maybe it's my own fault. Maybe I need to familiarize myself with what you're arguing. So you're saying that God cannot use...
and I could be presenting it wrong.
No, maybe. I suppose an analogy would maybe help me out. Is there an analogy that you could create that would help illustrate what you're trying to communicate?
I can try.
Yeah, please.
This is a new argument I'm using, so I'm still
feel it out
here.
Yeah, give it a try.
But analogous wise, okay. So let's say we have like a box, right? And the box is this worldview, and so in order to grant the box reality, it has to be proven in the set of like a room. Like in order to know that the box exists, you have to have the context. Like the room has to be there. And I think what I'm arguing is that the box cannot exist independently. As an analogy, in regards to proof, you can prove the box
only in regards
exists
to proof. So you're saying
if
that
you're inside the box.
Right, so you're saying the box can exist independent of observers and proof, but...
I'm saying the box cannot exist independently of the room.
Okay, so then draw out what that analogy means. So in respect to the Christian religion, what is the room and what is the box?
I would say, okay, well, let's go. Let's say the room is God. And I would say it requires a greater context to exist, to prove the existence of the box. And it's not necessarily the best analogy, but it's saying that the existence of the box is dependent on the existence of the room in regards to absolute knowledge, in regards to proof. You can believe in the box without absolute knowledge, which is why I argue for, very similarly, internally consistent worldviews. Which is why I say my worldview is internally consistent. I don't have access to an external thing to prove it absolutely. This is why I'm not saying absolutely you are wrong. Does this make sense?
Yes. So your worldview is internally consistent. You feel that you're justified in believing it, even if you can't prove it.
Externally, correct.
Externally. But internally?
I can't prove it externally. Internally, I think it's internally consistent. Nothing can be internally proven.
Okay, so...
for example, this is one of the axioms of the theorem. If an axiomatic system can be proven to be consistent from within itself, then it is inconsistent.
Yes, you did say that. Okay, great. So internal consistency, we would both agree with this. Internal consistency is not itself an evidence of its truth. Right? The atheist worldview is internally consistent. An atheist can explain the world atheistically insofar as, so long as God does not himself interject himself so obviously as to make the worldview inexplainable. And An atheist worldview can be internally consistent to a degree, I would argue. You can explain the world atheistically. That doesn't mean atheism is true. Likewise, you can explain your worldview, perhaps internally consistency, as can I. That itself, it does not demonstrate its truth either.
We have to go externally, but I'm arguing that we do not have the capacity to do that as humans.
Well, that's what I argued. If we're based on, and that was my opening statement, so long as we're on, we're looking for truth solely on the basis of human autonomy and human reasoning, we'll never find absolute truth.
And okay.
So it sounds like we're in agreement.
This comes back to the idea of objective reality.
Right.
Which we were discussing earlier.
Right, and I think you would agree there are things that are objectively true. Perhaps we don't know them.
It depends on how we define the terms, but I would hesitantly say I would disagree with that.
Really? So you don't think there are things that exist that we don't know about?
That is not the same thing.
Oh, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, do you think there are things that are real that we are, humanly speaking, unaware of?
I think it depends on the words you use and what you mean by that. Because on the base sense, the only thing that I know is I think, therefore I am, and the things that I'm experiencing are the things I'm experiencing. So on a fundamental epistemological confidence I know level, the only things that I'm aware of, the only things that exist are the things that I can observe.
Okay, so then I would ask you, how can you become, in any hypothetical you want to create, imagine you could have a wish and it would come true. How could you, given your human condition, become absolutely certain that the external world and things other than yourself exist? How could you become certain of that?
I don't think you can be certain of anything other than the fact that you exist.
Even if you were granted any hypothetical you wanted?
Even if.
I could come up with 100 ways just using my imagination.
Do you have an example?
Certainly. Again, this is a hypothetical, so please allow me to use my imagination. Imagine I had a piece of paper that had the truth written on it, and by the truth I mean concerning the external world. So the truth, the paper said nothing more than the external world you're experiencing, it actually exists, and that was true. In that world, in that hypothetical, insofar as that piece of paper is telling me the truth, that would be a way for me to know, because it told me the truth.
Well, I mean, you're assuming that it told you the truth. You can't directly experience that.
But what I'm saying is, in my hypothetical, that piece of paper is telling me the truth.
Well, your hypothetical is assuming absolute knowledge. I feel like that's a contradiction, in a sense.
Okay. Why?
Because my premise is that you cannot know anything beyond that you exist. Essentially, like the sensation that you have. And you're arguing that it is possible to have...
privilege to information?
That's not that's not it. I mean, you're arguing that it is possible. The hypothetical doesn't necessarily present any new information other than saying, well, yes, you can have information that you know absolutely.
All I'm saying is, it seems that you've created perhaps a standard of knowing that leaves you in absolute skepticism. You don't allow for in your worldview, you don't allow for a means by which the human mind can apprehend truth in any sense. I mean, you have adopted hyper-skepticism.
In a sense, I would argue that the truth is what you perceive.
But can what you perceive be true?
It depends on what you mean by truth.
Yeah, I guess
I think we have two things, which is internally consistent. For example, if I'm sitting here and I see like a pony materialize in my room and then disappear, in one sense I'm going to be, this is not true because it's not consistent with the rest of my experiences, because ponies just don't do that. Like, that seems to violate everything I know of physics. But on the other sense, it is true because I had that input into my brain, and now I'm thinking, where did that pony come from? And I'm being forced to reconcile it. So in one sense, it is true, but on the other sense, it is internally inconsistent.
The reason I asked the question I did was because it seems you've created a standard of truth that makes it impossible, even if Christianity is true, even if the Christian God is real. It sounds like you have erected a standard of truth that makes it impossible for him to essentially reveal the fact that he is true to you in a way that would convince you.
I have been convinced before, and I would say he has revealed the truth to me before from that perspective. And I believed very truly. So in a sense, and I believe the same as I do now, that you can't know anything for sure beyond I think, therefore I am. So I don't understand really how those two are incompatible.
They're incompatible because it seems that while you agree there are some things you can know, I think, therefore I am, you do not think it's possible that if God exists, that he could make you certain of his existence.
Well, you're certain of his existence.
Right, and I'm wondering how would you explain that other than saying that I'm delusional?
I think that is a question with many possible answers. I don't know you.
Okay, fair enough. I guess I'm curious. Given your subjective view of truth, I guess and this again goes back to our conversation we had before. I'm a little bit, I guess, bewildered as to why you are so committed to your present worldview. I guess it's not quite Zen Buddhism, but it certainly is close. The idea of the oneness of consciousness. I can't imagine how you, having adopted such radical skepticism, how you ever became so convinced that was true. I guess that was what sparked my interest in this discussion.
I think we likely have to make a distinction between convincing and knowing. I do not know anything beyond I think, therefore I am, but I can be convinced. To say that I don't know for sure does not mean that I cannot develop an internally consistent view of the world and have beliefs. So I believe that, like, consciousness is itself experiencing the universe simultaneously, that whole sort of thing. I do not know it in the same sense I know that I exist. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Did that answer your question?
I'd want to probe deeper, but I feel like not only would I bore people who are watching, I just don't think it would be necessarily be fruitful to our discussion. So let's either open it up to we could talk about consciousness, or open it up to questions, or we could try to reel the conversation back to our initial topic. And it seems like we're in agreement. We agree that if the Christian God is rejected, or if the Christian God is not true, you are left with a subjective view of reality and a subjective view of truth, which leaves us with nothing but speculation. In
technical and dry sense, yes.
Okay, so I think we're in agreement.
Yes.
Okay. Well, wonderful.
I like being in a constant skepticism, though. It's quite nice.
I wouldn't be able to live with myself, but
Okay. So I'd like to go on to the consciousness thing, if you guys are okay with that. What is the chat saying? I don't know.
I don't know either. I'm not even looking. So yeah, if you want to just go off on that.
Okay, so I believe that all consciousness is, for example, I am you, in the sense that there was no reason for me to be born in this way, and the only thing that distinguishes you from me is the fact that you are in a different body with different thoughts and minds, but there still is this absolute certainty of I think, therefore I am in both of our parts. And since that is the only thing we can know, and we both know the exact same thing, we are the same, in a sense.
You're saying that consciousness is fundamentally unified in its nature, not its experience. So
yes,
consciousness, the perceiving of self-perception, despite its differences, you're experiencing life as a young woman, I'm experiencing life as a young man, but we're both conscious. And so you believe all consciousness is one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, throughout many lifetimes.
Correct.
Yes. So I used to believe that too.
And why don't you anymore?
Why don't I anymore? It would be too simple to just say, well, now I'm a Christian, and then I'd have to explain, well, why did I become a Christian? And without having to, not that I wouldn't want to explain all that, it would take time. I would rather just point out some of the things that bothered me when I believed that, some of the things that still lingered in my mind causing me doubt, and perhaps maybe we mentioned them before. I was still curious if all consciousness is one, experiencing itself subjectively throughout many lifetimes. Either consciousness has to experience all of that simultaneously, which means consciousness would be rooted somewhere else other than in the material mind. So there would be like this ultra consciousness, which was experiencing all lives subjectively. So that would sort of be like God in a sense, a different kind of God. It would be more of like a pantheistic or panentheistic version. But that didn't seem to be the case because I wasn't experiencing all consciousness at once. So that wasn't true. And so then the alternative was that consciousness was a purely material property, part of matter itself. And then I had no reason to, I couldn't explain how if matter was in separate places at separate times experiencing lifetimes simultaneously, I couldn't explain what the chronological order of the experience was because I was only experiencing one at a time. I think you would probably understand what I'm saying better than perhaps the audience because right, I couldn't understand the chronology of it. Just like you said, you don't understand the reason that you're you and not someone else. The only explanation could be some kind of chronology, but I couldn't find any kind of mathematical or any kind of other reason for there to be a chronology. The chronology didn't make sense, but I had to believe that there was a chronology because I couldn't reconcile simultaneous experiences that I myself wasn't experiencing simultaneously. Right? It has to be chronological, or there are simultaneous experiences that I'm not experiencing, which means there would be more than one consciousness, and I couldn't reconcile that.
I feel like the responses I have to this are not in line with A leads to B, then to C.
But it would have to be, when I mean A, B to C, I mean like Rachael to Sean to David to, because you believe that you are one consciousness experiencing every lifetime, one at a time.
Well, what does the phrase one at a time mean to you?
You're only Rachael right now.
As far as I can tell, yeah.
Come on, not merely as far as you can tell. Certainly that is your experience.
Yeah, my experience is being born and leading up to this point.
Right, and so consciousness seems to be limited to singular experiences in bodies.
Apparently, yes.
Apparently. But you believe that your consciousness, which is part of all other consciousness because consciousness is one, is experiencing a chronology or a chronologic sequence of other lifetimes. So I am either your past or your future. I'm one or the other.
I would disagree that that it implies time.
Okay, but I mean, you said it yourself. I'm either your past or your future lifetime. From your present vantage point as Rachael.
No, I may have misspoke. I don't
Okay.
believe that you're past present. I believe when I referred to that, I was saying that is not what I believe when I was clarifying reincarnation and why I don't believe in that. Reincarnation seems to imply that there is some sort of a linear time that occurs. And I don't believe that when I say all consciousness is one, that it is time-bound by that statement.
But consciousness is bound by time, so far as we experience it.
Yes.
Okay, so...
Singly.
Right, so after Rachel's life is expired, you believe you will find yourself embodied again in whatever...
What do you mean by yourself?
It would be, again, it's that minimalistic view of consciousnness. It's stripped of all identity as Rachael, but still maintaining its fundamental identity as I think, therefore I am. The self-perception of consciousness.
By that definition, if you're calling you the I think, therefore I am, then that is, you fall into that definition as well.
Certainly.
I think, therefore I am.
Right.
So
but
by
there
that
has to,
definition, I am you.
right. But between us, once this life expires in your worldview, there will be a next conscious experience.
In the sense that humanity continues over time, yes.
Right, but since you believe all consciousness is one, that will be you, not
It
you,
will
Rachel.
be.
Right, and so
All
either...
the ones that will be born.
Right,
Correct.
right. So there will be, in a sense, your next lifetime. And by you, I just mean the one of which we are all part.
Agreed.
And that could be this one, or it could be another one.
Yes.
Right, and so I'm either one that you, from your present vantage point, either have experienced or will. So I am your past or your future in your worldview.
Or my present.
Your present is Rachael, very clearly.
I think that the words we're using are not quite the same.
Okay.
My present, when I say my present, I'm saying that you exist at the same time that I do in a separable kind of identity. But in the sense that we both think, therefore we are, that is the same nature. And those are existing simultaneously as a singular identification.
And yet, the experience is not simultaneous in the sense that I have no experience of Rachael, and Rachael has no experience of Sean.
In the sense that when you said when you strip it down, you get to I think, therefore I am, but there's extraneous things.
Right.
And those are the things that make us separate.
I understand that. And so that's where we get into the whole thing. All consciousness is one. Every lifetime is actually one consciousness experiencing all the many lifetimes. The question is, when and how is it doing that? Is it a chronological sequence in which, after one lifetime ends, it then experiences the next one? And so what is the chronology? Or is it a larger experience whereby there is a singular consciousness experiencing all consciousness simultaneously, which I don't think either can be true.
I'm having trouble with the words used.
I suppose.
Because I understand.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Because I understand, but I feel like it's very frustrating.
It's frustrating because using personal words to describe what you believe to be a singular person, as opposed to individuals.
Yeah, and you're saying this overarching consciousness, and I'm not sure what you mean when you say overarching consciousness.
Well, if you believe all consciousness is one, the question is, when does it become one? Was it one at the beginning or one at the end?
You keep using time-based words, and I don't think
I can only do that because consciousness, in our experience, is bound by time.
Yes, but not the idea of consciousness being one. That is not bound by time.
But it is experienced in time, is it not?
It's experienced in time, but the nature of it, the oneness, is not time-based.
Okay, so let's then talk about the nature of consciousness. Do you believe consciousness is immaterial?
Well, okay, what do you mean by immaterial?
Not made of matter.
Not described by atoms?
Right.
That is very difficult to answer in the sense that the consciousness is the experiencing of. And the experiencing of does not appear to be something that you can describe with atoms. You can't point to this sequence and be like, this is the experiencing of. It doesn't work like that. But consciousness, I do believe, is built from matter, completely reliant on matter, on physics, on the way that math operates, and quantum physics, and the dimensions and everything.
Okay, so can matter exist without time?
I don't believe so.
Okay, so if consciousness is the product of matter, and matter is contingent, or rather, I'm not sure myself, is matter contingent upon time, or is time part of matter, or whatever. There seems to be a
always see-
relationship between
I
matter and
always see the
time.
dimensions as dependent on each other. Like usually, I would see like the third is depending on the second to construct it, and the fourth is depending on the third to construct it. It doesn't necessarily indicate the reversal, but I would assume that all of them exist simultaneously and as interconnected parts of each other.
Okay, well, if that is the case, then you cannot divorce consciousness from time.
Correct.
Okay, and so there is a sense in which what I was saying earlier has some merit, which is, and I think it presents an actual problem, perhaps even a contradiction for your worldview. If consciousness is bound by time because of its nature, because it's purely a material event or something based on, or is the byproduct of events in matter, you're going to have to either say that consciousness is one experience, experiencing all things simultaneously without time, which I don't think is viable, because we both agreed that you can't have consciousness if you have a material view of it. You can't have consciousness without time.
Yes.
And then the alternative is equally problematic. You have simultaneous experiences which cannot be simultaneous in your worldview. They're not allowed to be.
Why are they not allowed to be?
Because the experience itself is not, like Rachael and Sean are having subjective experiences, but they're not occurring if we are the same experience. We're not experiencing those two separate ones simultaneously to ourselves.
If I understand you correctly, I believe that I was trying to address this earlier in saying that I believe you're mixing the identity, the I think, therefore I am, with the properties of that identity. Am I understanding you correctly in this?
And if I'm trying to understand you correctly, you're saying that I'm confused because even though we are distinct embodies, the nature of consciousness, you're stressing it, the unity of its nature.
Right.
I guess what I'm trying to draw out, I'm trying to say that there is a problem because of the simultaneous nature of our embodied experiences, the fact that we interact with each other at the same time and yet in some sense at a different time. That's the problem that I'm having.
I don't necessarily see that as a problem.
That's perhaps a failure on my part to articulate what the problem is.
Possibly. It's difficult to talk about without being incredibly precise with the terms, and I feel like the English language is not highly appropriate for discussing this sort of thing.
English is the only language I know, so I apologize. Yeah. That's the only one I can
no.
use.
I mean, just language in general. Like, we have to be incredibly precise with the terminology because it's so easy for them to flip back and forth.
Right. Okay, then we'll move on from this conversation. All I want to say is this. When I believed as you believe, a lingering doubt remained simply because I couldn't reconcile the nature of time with my understanding of the nature of consciousness. There seemed to be a contradiction.
Yeah, this would be something interesting I'd like to write about and discuss more, but I would think I have to give it very careful thought and figure out the terms very precisely before I can do that.
Okay, I can appreciate that. All right, why don't we ask the moderator if there's anyone who's been trying to get our attention, or if not, we can perhaps figure out where to go from here.
Hey, actually, there was a point that was made earlier by some of the audience members who thought that some of your claims regarding an infinite regress being impossible were dependent on a particular view of time.
Me?
Okay.
No, not you. Shut up, Michael. I've got a friend here, and he's talking. Anyways, are dependent on a view of time that is contradicted by a different view of time as a dimension, which is more supported by the view of relativity. The idea that an infinite regress is impossible seems rebutted if we take a view of time as being like a dimension is to the left or right. Do you agree or disagree with that? Why is an infinite regress necessarily impossible?
Well, in relativity, so time being relative to other events of time, or if you understand time to be an extension of space, or space is time extended in 3 dimensions, there is a sense in which there is independent. So you can picture in your mind, just to visualize, you can have 2 spheres of time in relationship, relative to each other, in which time is happening faster here than there relative to itself. So perhaps one is traveling faster than the other, or there's gravity here, no gravity here, gravity affects time. So there's a sense in which these two time spheres are relative to each other. But then there's even consistent with relativity, there's such a thing as cosmic time or absolute time, in which both of these times exist relative to each other. And so in that sense, what I was saying is this: time in the absolute cosmic sense, and even then on the more minuscule relative sense, cannot be regressed infinitely. That is to say, you cannot have two spheres of time or two events in time and then regress them infinitely, in the sense that you cannot have an infinite past for both. Time itself, if it is as we understand it to be, which is a sequential addition of time, and I think quantum mechanics have demonstrated through, I'm not sure if it was the atomic clock or I don't think quantum mechanics has anything to do with the atomic clock, actually. Someone mentioned, and I'm going to have to do the research on this again, I don't know who it was, they posited a quanta of time, which was the smallest divisible unit of time, and I think they demonstrated that time was digital, not analog. They showed that time is actually based on a quanta, and this is where quantum mechanics get in, quanta being the smallest divisible unit. Time is based on the sequential addition of the quanta. And so if that is correct, if each moment of time is digital, that is, it's one sequentially, one after the other, you cannot have an infinite sequence of finite events infinitely into the past. And the reason you can't is because of the infinite regression. You cannot regress infinitely into the past, otherwise you have the problem of how did we ever reach the present? Because you cannot pass an infinite. So if there was an actual infinite past based on sequential addition, or quanta of time, we never could have reached the present, because you cannot come to the end of an infinite. So if there was an infinite before right now, we never could have reached the present.
Okay, so I don't want to, get into this question too much, because obviously this is more y'all's deal. But it seems to me that if, as relativity suggests, you and I can experience two different presents by going along the timeline at two different speeds, then it seems the only way to view absolute objective time is as a dimension with some space in one direction or the other, with it being theoretically possible for us to move in either direction or at any speed along that timeline. And so I guess I feel like you keep asserting that it is impossible for an infinite regression to occur, but I don't know that if it is a dimension, for example, it's theoretically possible for me to have an infinite amount of space to my left or to my right. And so if we can agree that it is a dimension, which is suggested by the fact that there can be multiple different presents, then it seems difficult to defend the idea that an infinite regression is logically impossible. That's the last I'm going to say about this, and then I'll let you guys go on your thing.
I can appreciate that. I would disagree that it can be an infinite amount of space to your left or right. I also believe space is finite as well, and I think the latest studies, if I can find a source for that, I think they've said that because of the expansion of space, expansion indicates well, exactly that, expansion, which means finitude. It has an actual size. People actually have an actual calculation on what exactly the size of the universe is. Obviously, it's expanding, it's getting bigger, but there is a present calculation. So I don't think time's infinite, or space, and I think time and space are either related or are actually extensions of the same thing. That's why they talk of space-time. So I think space and time are finite, and I think science has, if not demonstrated that, it certainly is leaning in that direction.
I have thoughts on this, but in the sense that not all infinities are the same, and it is possible to have circumstances where you can't have infinite regressions. But that does not mean that all infinite regressions are impossible or do not exist.
I would say that infinite regressions are fascinating. They should be understood. In philosophy, I think they're one of the more important concepts because they apply to so much. We've talked about them in a few different contexts. We've talked to them in relation to like physical properties, time. You can talk about them in mathematically. You can even talk about them in logical arguments. And so I guess I would just encourage people to understand them and why I rely on them as essentially an axiom in a lot of what I argue. I think in most cases, if not all, actual infinite regressions in reality are impossible, as far as I know. I think you can create hypotheticals in mathematics where they work, but I don't think you can have actual infinite regressions. I guess that's all I have to say about it for now.
Okay, Rachel, do you have a reply to all that, or?
Not more than what I've already said right now.
Cool.
Is anyone in the comment section that wants to
let me see.
Submit a suggestion?
Yeah, if you're in the comment section and want to say something, do so. Otherwise, I'm leaning towards letting you guys go ahead and say your final responses.
Sure.
Wrapping this thing.
I think the conversation essentially ended with us in agreement. I think we agreed that if the notions of objective truth are rejected, such as I presented, you are left with speculation and skepticism and subjectivity. And I think that was agreed upon.
Nice. Okay. So if you guys have nothing else to say, then I'm going to go ahead and make some final remarks, and then we'll wrap this up. Sound good?
Sure.
Okay, cool. Thank you for watching the premiere episode of A Debate Show Without an Interesting Name. Next week, I will be debating John W. Loftus on Chapter 15 of his new book, Christianity is Not Great. Chapter 15 is it's entitled, Doth God Care for the Oxen? And it's about whether or not it makes the claim that the Bible is cruel towards animals. So if you're interested in that, tune in. You should like the Facebook page, facebook.com/uninterestingdebateshow. Thanks for watching. Peace.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.